Good afternoon, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of Action Against Hunger UK. It's a real pleasure to have you with us for this really important conversation on ESG leadership. For those of you who are new to the organisation, Action Against Hunger is a global humanitarian charity working to save the lives of malnourished children and help vulnerable communities build sustainable futures. For nearly 50 years, we've responded to some of the world's most severe hunger crises, driven by conflict, climate change, and economic instability. But we're not just about emergency response. We work on long-term systemic solutions powered by science, local knowledge, and collaboration, particularly with the private sector. I'm Hoete. I'm a trustee of Action Against Hunger and someone who's deeply passionate about the role that socially responsible business can play in creating a more just and sustainable world. My own background spans both corporate and non-profit work, and I've seen firsthand the impact that aligned partnerships can have, not only for communities, but for the companies involved. Today we're looking at ESG, environmental, social and governance, as more than a framework. For businesses in the legal, tech, and insurance sectors, ESG has evolved from a compliance box tick into a strategic driver of resilience, innovation, and growth. Regulators are tightening requirements, particularly in the EU with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and similar movements are underway in the UK, in the US, and even beyond. Clients, investors, and employees alike are demanding more transparency and more impact. But here's where it gets exciting. The S in ESG is moving to the forefront. Social impact is no longer the softer side of ESG. It's increasingly central to business performance and stakeholder trust. And this is where collaboration with charities can really play a transformational role. By partnering with mission-driven organizations, businesses can bring authenticity and scale to their social strategies while delivering measurable outcomes that really matter. That's at the heart of today's session. You'll hear from a really fantastic panel of experts across sectors, people who are not only navigating this ESG evolution, but shaping it. Together, we'll explore what leadership looks like in this space and how business and charity partnerships can unlock that shared value, and what practical steps ESG professionals can take to really lead with purpose. Thank you again for joining us. We're really so glad to have you with us. Before we get started with the discussion proper, it'll be really good to introduce our panel. And I'm going to jump to, I'll pick someone from the panel, and every member of the panel, I'd be grateful if you could introduce yourself and tell us your name, your job title, where you work, and what one word that comes to mind when you think of ESG. So in the spirit of ladies first, I think I'll start with Lauren.
Thank you, Hoete, and lovely to meet everybody, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name's Lauren Sugden. I'm the Sustainability Supply Chain Lead at Honda Motor Europe. And my one word for ESG and what I kind of think about today is impact.
Amazing, thank you. We can go to Ewan.
Hi there, everybody. Ewan Murray. I'm a partner in the sustainability practice at Bain & Company. I focus on corporate and supply chain decarbonisation and other largely environmental topics across a range of different industries, but with a deep focus in food, consumer products and agriculture. My one word here would be opportunity.
Opportunity. Okay, we can go to Andrew.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to speak on this webinar. I'm Andrew Izzet-Lee, and I work at DLA Piper as a social impact manager. The word I would use is evolving. This space is ever changing, and even in my remit, when I first started in this space, it initially went from working with charities and not-for-profits, but now in my current role, I do a lot of work with our suppliers and even other types of organizations we partner with.
Thank you. And now we can go to Michael.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Waity. My name is Michael Watson. I'm a partner and head of climate and sustainability advisory at the international law firm Pinson Masons. My job is to coordinate our teams that advise clients in relation to their sustainability strategies and implementation of those strategies. And my one word when one talks about ESG that I would refer to is sustainability, as I think it better describes what we're trying to achieve.
Amazing. Thank you all. Those are really dynamic and optimistic words to kick us off. So that's fantastic. So I'm going to jump in with a question for Ewan. Recent geopolitics and the state of the global economy seem to be taking us in the wrong direction on so many sustainability topics. Are you still optimistic?
Great. I mean, it looks like we're starting with the difficult questions first.
We are.
So, you know, it's you know, at this time, progress really can feel slow. It can feel like we're even moving backwards on some topics. But I think overall, I'm still optimistic. We've gone through a bit of a change these last years. I think in the early part of the decade, as we looked at what companies were doing, especially when it came to climate and some other sustainability topics, really we were in a bit of a target-setting arms race. Everybody trying to outdo each other with public commitments, and it often felt a little bit like it was corporate strategy by press release. And you know, there was a buzz to that. We were reading it in the paper, seeing it on the news. I'm sure everyone felt that. But frankly, it was probably a bit of a bubble as well. And then I think maybe 18 months or so ago, we started to move into this new zone with much more of a focus on action and results, not just on announcing new targets. I think that predated the recent geopolitical shifts, but there's no doubt those have accelerated that trend. There's less buzz, but I do underneath that see a much greater focus on action. I think there's a sort of new degree of realism from companies on really just what it takes to deliver. And that's ultimately much more important to delivering success. You know, those that are making the most progress fastest are the ones that have linked ESG and sustainability to core value creation. And those that can best demonstrate results are those that are fully integrating this into how they do business. And I know we're going to talk more on that in a little while, but that's what gives me optimism still.
Amazing, thank you. That's really useful and kind of kicks everything off on the right tone. I do just want to reach out to our audience and to those who've joined the call to say that we're really keen also to hear from you. So please do pop any reflections and any questions into the chat or into the Q&A function on this call, and we'll do our best to incorporate your comments and questions as we go along. So now I have a question for Michael. As regulations around ESG evolve, what do you see as the most significant challenges that businesses are facing in complying with these new standards? How can partnerships with charitable organizations play a role in addressing these challenges?
Thanks, Waity, and thanks, Ewan. Yeah, completely endorse what you just said in relation to the kind of geopolitical challenges and the meaningful aspects of that. So firstly, on the first part of that question, Waity, you were asking what the significant challenges our businesses are facing, and it's that confusion and the maelstrom that exists in relation to the geopolitical divergence that we're seeing globally, where in some jurisdictions one can definitely identify a kind of deregulation environment, a move away from stronger ESG and sustainability regulation, and yet another, and that's the impression I think we have over the last 6 months that's been happening. In reality, actually, that's not the case. We participate in a range of global policy monitoring or communities. And actually, when one looks at what's happening globally, there's increasing regulation around ESG and sustainability, not consistently, but inconsistently across different countries. So the key action for business and for society generally and governments is to monitor and scan the horizon in relation to how that regulatory position is changing, which is definitely more difficult at the moment, but in order to comply with it. And then the second point I would make is compliance is a sort of necessary but not sufficient aspect of if you like, regulation at the moment. One needs to take a medium-term view and anticipate what the general trends are around regulation and not just work out as a business what should you do, so what must you do, but what you should do in the context of how regulation is going to change. So it's that evolving picture and kind of separating, if you like, the signal from the noise of the trajectory of regulation. So that very much is a kind of challenge at the moment, but very much a critical action, I think, for business and businesses generally. On the second part of your question, how can a partnership with a charitable organisation play a role in addressing these challenges? I think there are two aspects here. Firstly, charitable organisations can tailor programmes to specific jurisdictions. So as I said earlier, there's differences depending on which geography, which jurisdiction you're in, and tailoring a programme that responds to the particular regulatory requirements and direction of travel in that country or nation is a particular, I think, a particular aspect of charitable organisations because they have that kind of local knowledge and can tailor matters to the local regulations. And secondly, I think they can help bridge the sort of say-do gap. Ewan talked about targets, and obviously targets were important, but more importantly is what you're actually doing. And charitable organisations and partnering with charitable organisations on specific programmes provide evidence of what you're actually doing and reduce the risk that you're exposed to in terms of being accused of not doing what you say you're going to do in terms of your targets.
Well, thank you for that. Does anyone else on the panel want to pick up on anything that Michael had to say before I give him another question?
I'm happy to pick up on the charity piece. And I completely agree with what Michael's saying as well in regards to that kind of tailored programme and also having that experience on the ground, because every single kind of different country, depending on what activities you're engaging with as a business, there are going to be different needs or requirements based on, for example, with us, the suppliers that we engage with. So by having those communities on the ground, you can actually understand maybe more the challenges which are being faced and they're easier to address, and you can actually drive and make impact rather than just mapping a supply chain, for example.
Amazing, thank you. So back to you, Michael, with another question. In your experience, what separates companies that drive meaningful ESG impact from those that simply meet regulatory expectations? So what are the biggest mistakes that businesses make when they're trying to integrate sustainability and social responsibility into their core strategies?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And yeah, so I think there's two or three key aspects here to the first part of that question. Again, what separates companies that drive meaningful impact? Well, I think the first point I'd make is C-suite or senior executive level sponsorship and endorsement. Winning, that's a kind of necessary, in my view, first step to the implementation of an effective program. If you've got that from your chief executive officer or your executive team, that support and engagement, and winning that such that it becomes on their part almost an intuitive understanding of why the business is doing this is really important. And then I'll just expand a bit on what I said in relation to the say-do gap. I think then when one comes to implementing the programs, I think it's important not just to have targets, as you talked about, but also to have clear plans, transition plans, perhaps, that you describe them as to how those targets are going to be achieved and the role of the programs we're talking about, the ESG programs, have in achieving those targets. So actually a written and articulated plan across the organization as to what you're going to do. And the third point, I think, is the kind of operational implementation of that. Then once you've got that kind of C-suite engagement, once you've got the plan, then looking across the organization and making sure it's implemented properly bearing in mind, I think the point you made in the introductory comments, the level of transparency these days is absolute. So assume everybody knows what you're doing. So I think that that kind of having the C-suite engagement and the transition plan are critical aspects of effective implementation and meeting those regulatory expectations. On the second part of the question, the biggest mistakes businesses make when trying to integrate sustainability, I'd make one very simple point, which is not integrating sustainability programs alongside your core strategy is the biggest mistake. And it is critical that it is articulated and evidenced that a sustainability program is a core part of delivering the successful outcomes for your strategy. It's an economic necessity, and making sure that the program doesn't sit too separate from the core strategy of your business, but is more a fundamental part of the overall business strategy. And I think that's more important than ever, given the comments already made by you and others on the geopolitical side of things. I think that's where in the past there's been challenges, and correctly so, where businesses have been challenged for not being clear as to the ESG programs integration in the overall delivery of the strategy for stakeholders and businesses. Hopefully that kicks that off.
Thank you, Michael. That's really very clear. I'm going to move to you now, Lauren. Supply chain sustainability is a critical component of ESG. Can you tell us about the challenges that you have encountered in making sure that supply chains are more sustainable, and also how collaboration with external partners like charities has helped address any of those challenges?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a really great question. And yes, there are many challenges, but I think I wanted to try and highlight just maybe a few of those on today's call. So, yeah, supply chain, as you've said, the sustainability, it's a crucial component of ESG. And the reason I say that is because the majority of organisations' environmental and social impact often lies outside its own operations. So this, of course, adds an additional layer of complexity and challenges for many reasons. I think, firstly, one of the challenges I'd like to touch upon is the complexity of a global supply chain. It makes visibility and accountability really difficult. Most kind of large corporate organisations as well, they'll work with a vast array of suppliers. So it could be from small local firms to large multinationals, each with different levels of sustainability maturity as well. So some are highly advanced in their ESG practices, and then you have others that are just at the beginning of their journey, or some cases that still haven't started at all, which sometimes surprises me. So I suppose standardising then sustainability practices across such a diverse range of suppliers is really challenging, particularly when those maturity levels are so wide. And also each supplier operates with different priorities, capabilities and pressures as well. So I suppose it's a bit of an example. It's like trying to build a puzzle where every single piece is manufactured by someone else with their own design. So it becomes a real challenge. And I think another thing that I wanted to raise for a challenge is just in regards to influence. So as an organisation, yes, you're going to be a client to a supplier, but as an example, the spend might be very minimal relevant to their total revenue, meaning that sometimes there's a lack of leverage to real drive meaningful change through traditional procurement pressures alone. So I think that's why collaboration is really crucial. And going back to then your second point, Yvette, around kind of charities and how you can include those, I think one thing that I've seen throughout my roles that's really promising is that ESG is moving more from being like a traditional business driver framework to more charities and NGOs actually playing a real key role in supporting ESG goals, especially, for example, within a supply chain. So those types of organisations, kind of going back to what Michael was saying, they bring a level of expertise in environmental and social issues. They've got those access to local communities. They've also got credibility. So it helps companies kind of engage, in my example, suppliers. And those external partners also have the ability to support organisations to go beyond ESG compliance as well and make real impact on the ground. And one example actually from a conference I joined last week is Save the Children, and they focus specifically on children's rights. They support organisations with corrective action plans, they work with local communities to create safe job opportunities, remediate and prevent child labour violation within the supply chain, driving that responsible business practice.
Just to drill down a little further in that, because you've answered some of this already, but when looking to enhance supply chain sustainability, what should companies sort of prioritise when they're selecting their third-party partners?
Okay, another great question. So I think when selecting third-party partners to support supply chain sustainability, organisations should prioritise firstly in alignment with their ESG values, especially around examples such as emission reduction or ethical labour or responsible sourcing. So kind of without that shared foundation, I think meaningful progress is really difficult. I also think it's really important to look for evidence of any past performance. So is there any impact metrics or case studies? And also seek peer-to-peer feedback from your network as well. So I've reached out to some of my networks to learn firsthand what their experience is as well, which can reveal quite a lot. Transparency is also really key. So strong partnerships, they're kind of built on openness. They're usually very open about their data and challenges, which allows for honest collaboration. At the same time, I think we also have to realise that not every partner will be fully mature in their sustainability journey, and that's absolutely fine. It's just making sure they've got that willingness to grow and engage. And I think my final point as well would also to be consider their local and long-term impact. So again, as an example, if you were focusing as an organisation on fair wages, do they support that, or do they support community well-being? Are they bringing innovation or scalable ideas to the table? And I think these types of factors are really critical to build that resilient and future-fit supply chain.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I now have a question for Ewan. Your focus is on food and consumer goods. How do you think about the link between decarbonisation, wider sustainability, hunger, and then business resilience and profitability?
So, the world's a complex place, and the reality is these issues are all interlinked. They don't always align perfectly, but they are interdependent. And yet there's often a sweet spot where you can drive improvements on all, or at least a number of those in one go. I'll maybe share an example. So Bain is a partnership with the World Economic Forum, where we help run an initiative called the First Mover Coalition for Food. And that brings together leading companies in the food system with farmer groups and NGOs and banks and governments. And the focus really is big. The focus is on the major global commodities. So beef, looking at Brazil and deforestation, wheat, corn and soy in North America with a focus on regenerative agriculture. And then rice in South and Southeast Asia with a focus on farm productivity and climate and water. And really the aim here is to use the power of the market, to use corporate demand signals in the supply chain to then de-risk the financing and the other implementation support that farmers need to drive improvements on affordability, resilience, sustainability, and beyond. And really, I think what it means is we're not actually directly solving the climate problem or the resilience problem. Really, it's a challenge with the existing business models and operating model in the supply chain. But by getting retailers and consumer products companies and traders to send more of a consistent demand signal that they support this, it then unlocks the right incentives to crowd in the expertise and the financing that unlocks all of these positive changes. So in Brazil, for example, where land ownership rights are often really quite uncertain. Part of the process is about driving the recognition and regularization of beef farms with clear boundaries between what's grazing and what is the Amazon forest. And when you start to do that, it then allows the farmers and the ranchers themselves to start to access commercial capital directly because they are credible, legitimate businesses now. And that then drives sustainable productivity with income benefits for them in the local community, and it takes the pressure off tropical deforestation. Similar in Southeast Asia, where we're unlocking training and investment for farmers in new growing techniques, and that drives productivity. It helps them access higher value end markets. So it has huge impacts for local income, but it also helps them cut water use and carbon emissions. So there's the environmental angle there as well. So, really overall, it's complex, but there are ways to sort of jig the system, if you like, to deliver those better outcomes for people, planet, and profitability into the mix.
Thank you, Ewan. You're a very demure and polite panel. So if any of you do want to jump in and disagree with any of your co-panelists or kind of add to, please feel free to do that. So I'll give you a moment in case anyone wanted to comment on what Lauren and Ewan had to say. Yes, Michael?
I could, if I may, just jump.
Please do.
Really thought Ewan's articulation was superb there in terms of the kind of interdependency, but I might just jump back to Lauren's comments in relation to the supply chain and draw together some of the comments we made on the introductory comments about the regulatory changes. And one of the things you talked about, Weti, was the European regulations in relation to reporting and due diligence. Now, they are currently under review as part of this kind of maelstrom or uncertainty. But I wanted to make the point that the direction of travel in relation to regulation is very consistent, in my view, in the sense that people at the top of supply chains, corporates at the top of supply chains, will be made responsible for their activities in their supply chain. They are commercially anyway, and there's a lot of regulation in the world that does make them responsible. There's this kind of press coverage covering the European Union changes at the moment, which indicates they will be rolled back and become less intrusive. In my view, well, that is happening, but in my view, that doesn't detract from the fact that the direction of regulatory travel is one direction, to impose obligations and liabilities and expectations and transparency on people's supply chains, and therefore, the comments Lauren made were spot on, but they are driven not just by good business practice, but by the medium-term regulatory trends that I think are really important to emphasise.
Thank you so much.
To add, I was just going to add back on that point, if that's okay. I completely agree with you, Michael. And I think one thing that's really positive to see is, yes, okay, we've had the omnibus and things come out from the European Union, etc. But companies aren't stopping. So they're not saying, okay, now I've heard this and there's rollback, I'm going to sit back and not do anything. I think we're all realising how critical it is to business to make sure that we're driving this type of activity forwards. And it goes back to, like we've said, we're now actually proving that organisations shouldn't just be doing this because they need to, it's because they want to and they have to, which is really positive to see.
Amazing, thank you. I'm going to turn to Andrew now. From your work, Andrew, in social impact and corporate responsibility, why should businesses better integrate social initiatives into their ESG strategies? What practical steps can they take?
Thank you. I think the first part of that question, the why should social initiatives be integrated? I think there's probably going to be a range of motivations for why businesses will take sustainability somewhat on board, and there will be different opinions on that within a business. So it could be the moral aspect, it could be the opportunities or the risks. But either way, I think we're now in a landscape where sustainability is, and I go back to the word I used earlier, evolving. It's very broad, and it's no longer synonymous with net zero and climate. So if you're really serious about sustainability to achieve your broader business goals, the social component cannot be disregarded, and it needs to be integrated into everything the business is doing. Otherwise, I think you'll get left behind whilst your peers are starting to really take sustainability forward. So I think that just makes business sense. And then the question you asked after, which I think is a bit more practical on the kind of what can actually be done, what practical steps can businesses actually take on board. One thing which some people may disagree on, I suppose, but from my experience, I've always tried to kind of work within my own remit, is adopting a mindset which prioritizes things quite strictly. So it's almost like having a less is more approach to what the working load looks like in practice, which is really hard, because as somebody who has a lot of passion for what I do, and I'm sure this is the case for a lot of sustainability professionals, you can often be overwhelmed with all of the work you're doing and want to solve everything you're doing. But actually, I've been a big believer in really being strict in selecting what are the must-haves and what are the priorities versus what do we realistically need to park just a bit later down the line to actually achieve better outcomes. And I think a lot of businesses who are resetting their strategies or doing a double materiality assessment maybe have a unique opportunity to really take a firm stance on that. It's just my opinion, but I will say it has got me somewhat far in achieving things, which I'm quite proud of. And it's something I always try to challenge colleagues with, just to make sure we're getting the most out of our capacity.
Thank you for that. Can you share examples where partnerships between corporations and charities have driven really tangible ESG improvements, and kind of also share with us what makes those collaborations successful in your view?
Of course. I think one particular partnership that I refer to was a pilot project which focused on mentoring local refugees in London. It was a project which was quite ambitious, I suppose, for where my organization was, because we didn't necessarily have a lot of expertise in our immediate team on refugees specifically. But in the end, by running the program in collaboration with the not-for-profit, we were able to achieve good mentee feedback. Two of the mentees actually received job offers in my organization, despite the program not being a pipeline program. And we got good feedback internally from our volunteers who are mentoring some of the individuals as well as being shortlisted for an award. So I think overall, the program did definitely deliver an element of shared value for all of the stakeholders involved. But I think the one thing which I always pin it back to was the very first conversation when we met the not-for-profit. We were very honest in putting our hands up and saying, there's probably things you're going to talk to us about which we don't necessarily have the knowledge or lived experiences to relate to, which was quite hard for me to own up to, if I'm being honest, because my grandmother came to the UK as a refugee, so I felt I should somewhat be a bit more equipped for the conversation. But also on our side, we were quite transparent in saying, there are certain things we can do and there are certain things we cannot do. This is the scope of what a partnership looks like for us. Please feel free to challenge us, but we just want to be really transparent and honest in saying, this is what we feel we can help you achieve. And that worked really well and helped us build quite a good, authentic and human connection.
So it seems like you're talking about like honesty and vulnerability to some level, to kind of admitting what you know, and then areas that are not within your kind of comfort zone. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think other panelists have referred to the role that charities and not-for-profits can play in this space. That they will often come with the knowledge and the expertise which perhaps others don't necessarily have. And there's nothing wrong with owning that. I think it's better to actually start from a place where you feel comfortable, as opposed to pretending to be on the same kind of level of knowledge on something which they spend all of their working hours focusing on.
Absolutely. I think Lauren wants to come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment, if that's okay, on Andrew's
Please
first
do.
question. And that was on why businesses need to integrate social value initiatives. And I fully agree with what Andrew was saying. I also think it kind of comes from two kind of angles that I saw in my previous role. So like for the UK, for example, there's a thing that's been implemented by the UK government called the social value model. Nowadays, if you're wanting to bid for public sector work, you have not got a choice if you're wanting to win to have social value initiatives, because there's a minimum of kind of 10% weighting that you'll find now come through social value contracts. So it's not a case again of, you know, nice to have, it's kind of a must have. And then I suppose it's looking at two different strategies. So you've got your corporate strategy around what you're wanting to do in regards to social value and impact and what aligns to your own business practice, but also then creating those opportunities at a contract level with your customers and aligning to their aims and ambitions, which may have kind of two separate programs. So how can you create impact at that corporate level, but also how can you support your clients on the ground through the contracts of work that you're delivering to also integrate social value, which I think is where you can drive real business impact and value, and also collaboration.
Does anyone else want to come in and comment on this before we move forward? Michael, jump in.
I could just jump in on something there. Different aspect, completely agree with Lauren's extrapolation of Andrew's comments. But another point that occurred to me, and I've experienced it over the last week or so talking to a number of clients, is if I go back to the comment I made regarding one of the key interventions, which is the buy-in from senior leadership and executive teams, there's very often a role for charities or people responsible for these sort of programs, you know, bringing them into the conversation with the C-suite directly so that they can see the impact of action or inaction, as the case may be. I saw an example recently with a client in the context of refugees, picking up Andrew's point, where bringing the expert from the relevant refugee agency in front of the executive team of a very significant client, they were able to hear firsthand what the impact was of climate and social issues on refugee trends, and then really brought to life from their perspective some of these issues and helped develop better senior leadership buy-in and sponsorship for the sustainability programs of that relevant corporate. So I think there's a key role there, picking up one of the earlier questions about what is the role for charities in that context. I think that's a very good example.
Andrew, you wanted to come in.
Yes, I think Lauren's point on social value is a really practical one, and something which has surprised a lot of people I've worked with across different employers. I think there's a lot of surprise to some colleagues when they find out that actually there's, you know, a real hard push for this stuff as part of contract opportunities, as opposed to it being something which we're deciding we're going to do out of the good nature. So for anyone who has any kind of space in social value or has a social value role, I would say that's always a good way to actually get on the agenda. It certainly gets people interested.
Amazing, thank you. I'm going to move now to one question for the whole panel, so you can all jump in at different points. As ESG continues to rise in importance across sectors, what does truly meaningful ESG look like in practice? And what practical advice would you give to businesses, whether they're just starting out or already on the journey, to ensure that they're not just ticking boxes, but driving real, lasting and sustainable change and impact for both society and the environment?
Maybe I'll kick us off, Huete, if that's okay. So Michael talked a couple of times now about some of the practical requirements for a successful strategy here. You know, C-level engagement, making it part of your strategy, embedding it in everyday operations and how your company does business. I completely agree. I think that's spot on. But you know, what should you do if you don't have that? How do you get from where you are today to that situation? I think that's really the challenge. I remember years back getting some training on good time management, and the advice was only do the things that only you can do. And at the time I thought, maybe that's a bit trite and even a bit arrogant, but I think there's a kernel of value in that as we think about this, where really it's about almost taking a step back and understanding what's the unique point of difference that you bring as an organization. What's the unique role that you can play? And if you're clear about that, then that will tell you from a ESG sustainability perspective, but also from a overall corporate strategy perspective, where you need to play and what you'll need to do to win in the market. And that really makes sure those two things come together. The other thing I'd say is just a bit more practical, and that's that nobody's perfect here. Let's not make great the enemy of the good. There's always simple things. There's always low-hanging fruit. So as you're doing this wonderful cerebral strategizing, just get started and you'll learn along the way. You'll build relationships, you'll build evidence, and that will snowball to create something that really drives impact.
Thank you.
Oh, go on, Michael.
Sure, I'll quickly, kind of just to build on that a bit, and I think, especially I like in this context, is every day is a school day in that context. So I would certainly agree with that. The other thing I was just going to build on a bit is picking up on this sort of transition plan. Say what your targets are and set out a plan for what you're going to achieve. Now, what truly meaningful ESG looks like in practice, I think one aspect of that is, if there's a regulatory impediment, i.e. if there's no regulation or the wrong kind of regulation, don't sit on your hands. One of the kind of key aspects of good transition planning for corporates and businesses is to have a plan as to how you influence the development of regulation, government policy, etc., to enable you to achieve the sustainable outcomes you're looking to achieve. And this involves obviously lobbying, informing, joining industry bodies to help the industry body make the relevant representations to government and regulators. So it's kind of insufficient, I would say, just to kind of say it's all too difficult because there isn't the regulatory support in place. You need to sort of step in and promote the right kind of regulation that will enable you to achieve the outcomes that you need to achieve for your business. So that's a kind of key aspect, I guess, involving public policy experts to help you with that.
Lauren, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, thank you. Again, just to add upon Michael and Ewan's point, really, I think I kind of wanted to go back to the word, and the irony is that was in the question that I raised at the beginning was impact. I think that if you're wanting to make impact, start small, but with intent as well. So don't do something just for the sake of it. Do something because it's going to make impact, and don't wait for perfection either. So I think just by starting to understand where you are at the moment is a great starting point, and then you can kind of engage with the relevant stakeholders from that and try to build a bit of a business case. And I think it's also really important to make sure that ESG is a core business function. It shouldn't be an add-on. It shouldn't be sat by its side. It should be part of procurement decisions. It should be part of product design. It should be part of logistics, supplier contracts. I think meaningful progress comes when ESG becomes a cross-functional responsibility and not just the job of a sustainability team. And I think it's really important, yes, to set achievable targets and make sure you measure and you're consistent and to be honest about your journey. But I think what's really important as well is that ESG is not just a reporting exercise. It should be a strategic imperative. And those who kind of approach it with that right purpose and that pragmatic approach will inevitably end up leading the way.
Thank you, Lauren. I think Andrew wanted to come in.
Yes, I would add, firstly, I would echo Ewan's point about the time management aspect, which I think very much, resonates with what I said earlier about the less is more approach and being really strict on choosing what needs to be done. I think if I could summarize maybe what good actually looks like, I would definitely say it needs to be authentic. The average person in the office you work in probably has a much better understanding of identifying what's authentic versus what isn't, compared to maybe 5 years ago. I think there are certainly cultural and demographic opinions on what authentic is, but generally speaking, people are getting a lot better with identifying what just looks like it's being done for the sake of it in a report versus what is being done from a genuine and true nature.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know, there's a couple of questions that I can see from the audience in the chat, and I wonder if we are able to hear from audience members directly, if they can ask their questions. I'd love to hear from Yael Nevo, I think it is, if possible. If not, I can read it out. Is it possible for Yael to ask their question? Mic is off. Okay, let me go ahead and read it out. Thank you to all the panelists for this insightful question. My question is about the diversity of the sustainability industry and whether, from your experience, the decision-making power allows for varied voices and perspective, for example, gender, ethnicity, disability, social mobility, etc. I don't know who wants to take that, but looks like a good question. Any of the panelists like to answer? Andrew, go ahead.
It's a really good and important question. I think what I will say is a lot more companies are engaging a range of stakeholders, internal and external, in planning what their priorities and strategies will be. So there is going to be some form of diversity, you would hope, within that range of stakeholders. The other point I would add to that, and it's not necessarily an answer, but it's something which perhaps I'm happy to speak about separately, is I've actually asked a similar question to the Institute of Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability, which is the ICRS, and that's an ongoing conversation which I'd be happy to include others in, because I think it's a very, very important question that we obviously need to be mindful of.
Thank you. I think Michael also wanted to come in, and then Lauren.
Yeah, just a very quick addition to that. I mean, Andrew's more expert than me to comment on that. I mean, my experience, it's more diverse, but there's a long way to go. It's just been my observational comment. But the one other aspect I'd add to that list is also intergenerational voices at the table. I think those can be extremely powerful from younger colleagues, stakeholders, and businesses. One of the kind of great beacons of hope, I think, in relation to sustainability is that generation, and bringing those voices clearly to the table is a really important aspect.
Lauren. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, no, really great question. And I just wanted to give an example of where I've kind of seen this brought to life. So in my previous organisation, they'd actually empowered employees to kind of have their own voice by creating networks and communities. So we used to have things like the DEI network, we used to have the environmental community. There were lots of different communities. And I think by allowing that, it made sure that we had a wide array of kind of voices being present and heard, able to drive impact through business and also try to shape that strategy. And you would find that the senior leaders would actually kind of listen, because you were empowering the employees to have a voice at the table based on kind of their own maybe personal passions or their interests or skills as well. And I found that was a really lovely sweet spot by kind of having, you know, the voices heard up from the senior management, not just always kind of looking down.
Thank you so much. We also have another question from David Henry, who thanks you for an interesting discussion, and asks, in your opinions, what skill sets will ESG professionals need in the future that we might be overlooking now? Ewan, jump in.
Yeah, I'll dive in. So, you know, when you get this right, this is transformational for your organization. And it is a whole business transformation. And if you think about something like IT, then if you're upgrading your IT system, you want the IT team in the lead, but you need the whole organization as part of that process. If you're changing your marketing strategy and launching a load of new products, you need marketing and PD in the lead, but again, it's a whole business transformation. And I think the same logic applies here. So we all need that level of business literacy, financial literacy, and to really understand how to drive organizational change. I think that's critical to seeing success. And then probably something about artificial intelligence, because it's been nearly an hour and no one's mentioned it, and I think you have to do that as mandatory now. But joking aside, there, I think in social and environmental sustainability, we've sort of gone from an environment when I first started where there was no data to one where now there's almost too much. And the challenge is separating out the noise to find the signal. And there, I think smart technologies, AI, will play a key role in doing that, and then getting that right insight to all the key decision makers.
Thank you so much. Andrew wanted to come in, and then Michael.
I think if that question was asked perhaps 10 or even as recent as 5 years ago, the answer would have been good Excel skills. And that's still important. But the good news is I think we've evolved from just relying on Microsoft Excel to do a lot of this stuff or track a lot of this stuff. I would say what's quite important, in my opinion, is having a very holistic view of your business and your issues which you're committing to. I think it just helps you on a day-to-day basis join dots within your organization to make sure there's no duplication, and that everybody understands what sustainability really means in the nature of operations. So yeah, I would definitely say just thinking about things holistically and trying to engage everybody in a very sensible way can actually help you solve a lot of the challenges going forward.
Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, it's a great question. My trite answer to the question of what skill sets do ESG professionals need, the trite answer is all of them. I think it's a classic example of a multidisciplinary capability. And I can illustrate it with an example. We often say, the kind of clients get the best advice, or we make the best decisions when you incorporate a really multidisciplinary approach, scientific expertise, legal, finance, consulting, public policy. I've missed a few, technology, all of those capabilities, and the great ESG professional can be a sort of, can maybe not a master of all of them, but certainly have a sufficient working knowledge of all of those areas and how they impact on the ESG outcomes one's trying to achieve. And an example in the context of climate and how it impacts on is, of course, on the scientific understanding of how attribution science can now pin make corporates responsible for existing climate damage in one part of the world where they've not operated, but where they've been carbon emitters in one part of the world. It's possible to evidence the direct connection with the climate impact in another part of the world. And there are a whole range of cases now going through the courts, pinning that risk, that liability on corporates, and therefore elevating the importance of transition. So it's having that knowledge and being able to bring that to bear for your organization or as an advisory capacity. It's a great opportunity and a great challenge.
Amazing, thank you. We've just got 4 minutes to go, and I want to squeeze in one question in my closing remarks. So if we could have like a 1-minute answer from perhaps one person, maybe two, to this question from Will, who is on the Action Against Hunger team. He said, I'd be keen to hear from the panel on what one ESG trend that they think is being underhyped and one that's being overhyped. Lauren.
I love this question, and I was having a little bit of a think about it when I went into the chat. So I think for me, the one that I believe, this is again personal, is underhyped, is biodiversity and nature-related risk. So there's a lot of focus on climate change and dominating ESG discussions, but the loss of biodiversity and then the potential disruption that it could have to supply chains or economies and ecosystems, I think it's really significantly underreported. And I know there are different frameworks coming out, like the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure, and it's just emerging. But I think this issue is likely to become a central ESG theme over the next kind of decade or so. And then an overhyped ESG trend, and I'm sure many would agree with this, is carbon offsetting, in my opinion. Many organisations are still relying heavily on purchasing carbon offsets rather than addressing emissions at the source. And I think, yeah, it may look great on paper, but the effectiveness and the actual credibility of offsets are increasingly kind of questioned, and regulators and investors, they're starting to demand real measurable emissions reductions. So I think this is making a potential risky kind of over-reliance from those organisations who are solely focusing on carbon offsets.
Fantastic. Okay, Ewan, do you want to come in with a 30-seconder?
Yeah, but I don't know what I'm going to say because I put my hand up and then Laura said it on nature. I guess maybe on carbon offsetting, and you were looking for a bit of controversy. I half agree with what Lauren just said. I mean, but not fully. It's clear that companies need to sort out what goes on at home first. They need to take action themselves and in their own direct value chains. That said, I do think there is a big role for channeling finance wherever we can get it from to preservation of nature as it exists today. It's easier to keep a forest standing than it is to grow a new one, and more money is needed into that space. So long as it is incremental, it's not at the expense of taking action at home, then we need it. And would completely echo the point on food. You know, if you look at where we're going on pollinators, on soil, on water availability, water pollution, those are all trending negatively. And that has direct corporate impacts, but it's frankly what feeds all 8 billion of us. So if we don't collectively get that right, then, you know, that goes right to the heart of the agenda we're talking about today.
Amazing, thank you. And we're into our last minute. So I just wanted to say thank you to all of our panelists for such a thoughtful and inspiring discussion, and to everybody who's joined us online today. We've covered a lot of ground, from the complexities of compliance to the real world impact of purposeful partnerships. What's clear from today's conversation is that ESG isn't just about risk mitigation, it's about leadership, it's about going beyond the minimum, moving to intention, impact, and recognizing that doing good and doing well are not mutually exclusive. Whether you're navigating regulatory shifts, redesigning supply chains, or integrating social impact into your core strategy, one thing is certain: no business can do it alone. And hopefully that's where charities like Action Against Hunger can be powerful partners, with nearly 50 years of experience delivering life-saving programs and driving systemic change. We understand what meaningful impact looks like and how to measure it. By working with us, your business can help tackle urgent global challenges while advancing your ESG goals in credible and measurable ways. If today has sparked ideas or even better inspired action, we'd love to continue the conversation. Whether you're interested in learning more, exploring a partnership, or simply hearing about the impact we're making together with the private sector, please do get in touch. We'd be really delighted to hear from you and to connect. Thank you again to our panel and to our audience for being part of this session and for your commitment to building a more sustainable and equitable future. Thank you, everybody.